Okay, great. And I guess we can get started. And thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk in this series. I really appreciate being able to frame some of my research in terms of conceptual engineering, because I mean, I feel it's still very much up for grabs what this kind of conceptual engineering community looks like and is going to look like. But one thing that's interesting about it, I guess, is that it brings together philosophers and other researchers who work on very diverse cases, often with very diverse concerns, and still find often rather surprising methodological convergences of the kind of issues that they face. And I do hope that that's also going to be the case in my talk today, which in many ways is probably quite different from the other talks that you've heard in the series. It's more empirical than other talks. It's also more directly political. At the same time, I do hope that in the end, I will come up with some methodological lessons that are hopefully also relevant for like a wider audience of philosophers who are interested in the whole conceptual engineering project. And so one thing that you may notice on my title slide is that I didn't have my name on there because I didn't really feel comfortable presenting this as like a single authored philosophy talk, because a lot of the stuff that I'm going to present is actually the result of a very collaborative effort between a lot of different people. I'm going to talk about 4 empirical case studies. The first 2 come from Latin America, from Brazil, largely out of this research group that you see on the top around Jabal El-Hani. And I'm mostly going to rely on data that have been collected on the one hand by Vitor, who's on the second on the right, and then by Jair in the blue shirt here, which are going to be my first 2 case studies. And then in the later part of the talk, I'm going to move from Latin America to West Africa and mostly Ghana, where I've been kind of tagging along in research that's been carried out by Birgit, who's a colleague of mine at Wageningen University. And we've been collaborating with a research group in Ghana, that's the Center for Indigenous Knowledge and Organizational Development, CICOT, which is organized by Bern and Daniel. So that's going to be my 3rd case study. And then the last case is actually partly drawing from a master thesis by Eva, who defended her thesis supervised by Birgit and me just a few months ago. So in a way, it is a philosophy talk that comes with my thoughts about conceptual engineering, but it's very much grounded in data that has been collected by others. And then it's not just a collaborative effort of working with other researchers, but it's also a collaborative effort of working with local communities. So the pictures that you see here are from a village, Sebinia, that I'm going to talk about, where I've also done some field work myself. But the 2 pictures here, the one on the left is Vitor, who I just mentioned, going out into the mangroves with a fisherman talking about the fish and the birds. And then on the right is another a PhD student, Gabi, who is working with a community in coming up with participatory ways of bringing different types of knowledge together and addressing environmental and social issues in the community. So there's not just the knowledge of other researchers in my talk, but there's also the knowledge of the communities that we work with, their considerations about their concepts that they use and the reasons why they use them the way they do. So in a way, I just wanted to start with that to kind of give appropriate credit to all of the people who've done the intellectual, but also like the material labor. But then I guess there's also maybe a little bit already of foreshadowing of some of the methodological lessons that I want to draw about how to do conceptual engineering and how to do conceptual negotiations in ways that actually respond to the concerns of people who typically do not have a voice in academic philosophy talks. Okay, so with that, here are the 4 case studies. I'm going to start in Brazil, and then going to move to Ghana, and then end with some more general lessons comparing some Latin American and West African debates about the concept of development. But before we jump into the empirical material, I thought maybe it makes sense that I say a few more general things about conceptual engineering. So I know a lot of people here working on that are engaged in rather complex debates about like what conceptual engineering is and how to define it and different kinds of conceptual engineering. I don't have like really, I think, a stake in that debate right now, and maybe a rather simple approach to that for me. Conceptual engineering, the way I use it in this talk, will be just kind of the complement to conceptual analysis as a kind of more normative aspect of not just trying to understand how concepts are structured, but having debates about the question how concepts should be transformed, right? And this could be like the kind of re-engineering of concepts that we already have, or it could be coming up with new concepts, or it could be eliminating concepts that we found to be misleading in one way or another. And in that sense, I guess conceptual engineering becomes a very broad umbrella concept that can be applied to a lot of very different concepts, right? So it can be applied to more like the epistemic concepts that we're used to discuss as academic philosophers, like concepts of knowledge, of objectivity, of justification, and so on. It can be applied to concepts in the empirical sciences, right? So what is a good concept of species? What is a good concept of disorder, and so on? And it can also, of course, be applied to everyday concepts. For example, all the kind of more normative debates about how concepts of gender and race should be used from a conceptual engineering perspective. So in that sense, for me, in the talk for now, conceptual engineering is just this kind of like broad umbrella concept, and maybe we can get back to the question whether I need to specify that in one way or another. But I thought it would be helpful to start with that. Now, why take all these kind of philosophical debates, whether it's about conceptual analysis or about conceptual engineering, to a global perspective and towards like a comparative perspective? Well, there are different types of reasons why you may want to compare those concepts cross-culturally. Some of them are more epistemically oriented, and I think this is something that many of you will be familiar with from experimental philosophy, for example, the question whether certain concepts that we engage with as philosophers, like paradigmatically the concept of knowledge, right, is just a reflection of our own contingent linguistic background, or whether those concepts are more stable cross-culturally, right? Other reasons for engaging with concepts cross-culturally are more directly normative or political. So, for example, on the right side here, you see a paper that I wrote on the concept of race, on the question of how race travels between different linguistic contexts. And so I got, for example, engaged in that debate about the concept of race and, if you want, conceptual engineering of race, because I'm not a native English speaker. And a lot of the debates in the philosophy of race on how to analyze the concept and what to do with the concept seemed very strange for me as a native German speaker, right? And so I was trying to understand how these concepts work differently in different languages, and then also normatively what it would mean to use these concepts in adequate ways in different linguistic contexts. And I think philosophy of race is like a great case study for that, because a lot of the racialized realities around the world, whether it is racialized realities in Darfur, or whether it is in the suburbs of a Latin American metropolis, or whether it is on the construction sites in Qatar, work very differently from how the standard examples in philosophy of race work that are typically focused on the US context and on the English concept of race, right? So there's also the normative idea that if we want philosophy to be relevant beyond just North America and Europe, we also have to engage with both the material realities and the concepts that are used to engage with those realities from a global perspective. And so one thing that will hopefully become clear along the talk is how these kind of epistemic and political reasons for engaging with concepts cross-culturally in the end kind of become entangled and influence each other. Okay, so that much maybe as an introduction, and let's jump into some of the empirical material. So the first case that I wanted to present comes from Brazil, from the northeast in Bahia, and a small fishing village that's called Serbinia. And so I've been part of a research group around Jabal El-Hani that has been working along very different dimensions with those community about different types of classifications, but also different types of knowledge, the question how to bring different knowledges together, how to translate them into policy, and so on. And I'm just going to present like a very small snippet of that relates to the negotiation and the analysis of concepts in that context. And so the work on that has been done by Vitor, who is a PhD student at the University of Bahia in Salvador and co-supervised by Jabal and me. And so what he does is, I think, in many ways familiar to those of you who kind of have read about experimental philosophy, but in other ways it's also quite different. And so one area where it's different is that we're here mostly working with methods from cognitive anthropology rather than cognitive psychology. So we're not taking people in the lab to do experimental psychology, but rather we're going into the community to try to understand how those concepts work in real life situations. Another aspect that's different from like standard experimental philosophy is that we're not really engaged that much with these standard cases of epistemic core concepts like knowledge or justification or objectivity. I don't think anyone in our team has ever asked anyone in the community how they would define those concepts, or presented them any of these kind of thought experiments on whether knowledge is justified true belief or something like that. Instead, we're trying to understand like everyday concepts in the community. And given that this is a community of fishers, what would be more obvious than trying to understand their concepts of fish, right? And so that's one thing that we've been working on for a couple of years now. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a speed run through some of the data. And then we can see what kind of interesting or not so interesting conclusions we can draw from that for conceptual analysis and for conceptual engineering. So Vitor's starting point is something that anthropologists call free listing. So in this case, Vitor would chat with the fishers, for example, join them in their boat, and ask them to list all the fish that they know. Right. So free listing is just kind of asking someone to name all the acts that they know, in this case, all the fish. And then he does that with several fishers to have like more data from different perspectives. And then in the end, you kind of have a set of all the concepts of fish that the people use in the community, right? And then what you see here on the slide is a little bit more complex. So it's not just a set, but it's an ordered list, because then you can use the data to kind of calculate what's called a salience index. You can look, for example, how often a certain fish is named. You can look also at what point is it named. Is it like the first one that comes up, or is it the last one that comes up? And through that, you can kind of create an ordered list of like the most salient fish. And on the slides, there are 21. There are, of course, many more concepts of fish in the community. We just have the cutoff point here, in part because otherwise it would become too complex to do the next steps of the empirical work. But it also kind of coincided quite nicely with the salience. So as you can see, we have like nice p-values for the first 21 and so on. So now we have like a list, right, of concepts, a list of concepts of fish and the most salient ones. The next step is that we're doing something that's called trial tasks. So we print out photos of the fish, and we present the fishes, 3 of them, and we ask them which of them belong together, or like which of them is the odd one out, right? And by doing that over and over with different kind of cards of fish, you can reconstruct the similarity judgments of the fishers about the fish, right? So in that sense, we end up not just with a list of concepts, right? But we come up with a more ordered taxonomy of the similarities between the fish according to the fishers. And you can represent that then as a taxonomic tree, as you know, from like biological taxonomy, where it's not just a bunch of entities, but rather they're ordered according to overall similarity to each other. So what do we do then that's philosophically interesting with this kind of data about concepts and their salience and their similarities or differences between each other? Well, one thing that we do is that we compare them with the kind of conceptual structures that we find in academic biology. So to what degree do the local taxonomies of the fishers are the same as the academic taxonomies that are used by taxonomists or other biologists, right? And I can only present to you like a little bit of that data because it's quite complex. But one thing that we find is that there are a lot of similarities, and there are also a lot of interesting differences between the concept that scientists use and the concept that the community use. In some cases, the concept of a fish has the same extension in the community and according to a taxonomist, right? So we have kind of conceptual convergence. In other cases, the community classifies things quite differently from how scientists do it. So simple cases are these cases of so-called lumping and splitting. So the fish that you see up here, the scientists would say, well, that's one species, right? But the community has 2 different names for 2 different subpopulations of that species, depending on, for example, morphological differences or where they're found in the river. In other cases, it's a community that's a lumper, and the scientists are the splitters, right? So in the case of the birds that you see at the bottom, the scientists would say, well, there are 3 different species of birds. Well, the community only has 1 name for them, right? They give like the same name for all 3 species. So they have 1 concept where the scientists have 3. Similar things are found in terms of these kind of similarity judgments. Sometimes when the community says fish belong together, they're similar to each other, these similarities are reflected in the way how academic taxonomies work. Those are the ones that have like the red lines around them, where the similarity judgments of the communities kind of reflect that the fish actually belong to the same order or even the same family according to the scientists. In other cases, the fishers say fish belong together even if they have not much in common. They don't belong to the same order according to academic biology, right? So the picture then is one that becomes very complex in the sense that it shows overlaps, areas where the concept of the scientist and the concept of the community are quite similar to each other. And they also show the partiality of these overlaps. There are a lot of differences in how these concepts work, how their extension is defined, but also, like, of course, in terms of the intention. And so one more general lesson that I want to derive from this is that I think a lot of our results kind of sit a bit awkwardly with the way how experimental philosophers or also philosophers of cognitive science more generally think about concepts when they think cross-culturally. A lot of the debate has been about universalism versus relativism. Right? So, for example, in this book, Epistemology for the Rest of the World is largely framed in terms of what the authors called the universality thesis, right? Whether a concept like knowledge is universal across different linguistic groups. And I think there are historical reasons for that, like how experimental philosophy is grounded in cognitive sciences, and the cognitive sciences kind of emerged from the cognitive revolution, right? That was very much about trying to detect universals, in part as like a counter movement to like the relativism of cultural anthropology of people like Boas or Sapir-Whorf. But at the same time, I think in a lot of the engagements that we have with local communities and their concepts, this distinction between universalism and relativism is far too simple. What we actually find is that concepts are in some ways similar, in other ways quite different. And if you actually want to understand how concepts relate from, for example, a local community to the concepts of scientists, you need to move beyond the simple universalism versus relativism distinction. And you have to try to understand the nuances of these kind of partial overlaps that I've been describing. Now, for now, that's just a claim, I guess, about conceptual analysis. But one thing that I will focus on now is that in trying to understand these different nuances of partial overlaps, there are also important lessons for conceptual engineering, because we want to understand how concepts are being negotiated in local communities. We cannot work with universalism versus relativism, but we have to have a fine-grained analysis of the kind of partial overlaps between different conceptual systems. And to further develop this, I'm going to move to my second case. And this time, the data is not collected by Vitor, but rather by Jairo. I think he actually is joining today. Hi. And so he's the first author of this paper that you see here that was published a couple months ago. And I'm just going to talk about some of the results from this. We're still in Brazil. We're actually still in Bahia, in the same state. But this time, not in a fishing community, but rather in a community of farmers that are especially famous for their pineapples, so pineapple farmers. And so just as in the case of the fishers, you could think, well, what are the most important concepts there? Maybe we would be studying concepts of crops, right, if they're farmers. Well, actually, one thing that Jairo has been studying is concepts of pests, which makes a lot of sense, because if a community of farmers is experts on anything and have fine-grained conceptual tools for anything, then it's for the kind of stuff that eats their crops, right, and kind of threatens their livelihoods. And just as in the first case, where we found these partial overlaps of some things are quite similar to scientific concepts, some things are quite different, we have the same kind of results here. So the first example is one of an overlap where things are actually quite similar. So in the case of, for example, this worm, the fall armyworm, the community has, of course, a different term than the scientists. They don't use a Latin name, or they don't use the English name, fall armyworm, but they have a term that refers to the same species with the same extension, right? So we have different terms, but the same concept. And this is a practically, I think, quite relevant result, because obviously if you want to engage with agricultural pests between very different stakeholders, like, for example, a community and a scientist and a policymaker, it's important to ensure that you're talking about the same thing, right? So if there are actually concepts that are referring to the same organisms with the same extension, you have conceptual tools that ensure that you're actually talking about the same thing. This does not mean that the concepts are always the same. And so one really interesting example from this field work are these little creatures that you see at the bottom right, which are according to biological taxonomies, insects, right? But in the interviews that Jerry did with the farmers, they explained that these organisms are actually fungi, right? So here's like a little snippet from one of the interviews saying, let me see, there's a fungus. It is very small. It almost does not seem to see. But when it arrives, it attacks a plant, and the plant looks bad, and it is very difficult to remove. So what to do with that type of conceptual disagreement, where scientists would say those organisms are insects, and the community would say those organisms are actually fungi? Well, there are different options, right? So one thing that you could say is, well, the farmers are simply wrong in considering these organisms fungi, and their concepts should be corrected. Now, looking more closely at the practices of the community, that's actually not a very plausible position. Because one of the things that Jerry found was that that those organisms are actually in many ways quite similar to fungi, and it makes sense for the community, given their practices, to classify them as such. So some of that you can actually kind of just see. They're morphologically, they don't look like an insect like above, right? So they don't have eyes, they don't have like the typical body of an insect. Then you could still say, oh, so they're just being misled by these superficial morphological differences. But it's not just the morphology, right? It's also like how these pests behave as agricultural pests, right? It's quite different to for example, as a farmer, to have to respond to a moving pest like a worm compared to those more static organisms. In many ways, both ecologically and for the reality of farming practices, these organisms behave much more like fungi than they do like insects, right? So from the perspective of the practices and the issues that actually matter for the farmers, it makes much more sense to classify them as fungi than as insects, right? So in that sense, the concepts are changing because the concerns of the communities are quite different than those of the scientists. Now, the second option would be to say, well, then, so the local farmers are just using concepts that are always well adapted to the local context, and so we should not change them ever at all, which in the end also seems too simple of an answer, because for a lot of farming communities, whether it's in Brazil or somewhere else, a lot of things are changing very rapidly, right? There are new forms of agriculture, there's climate change, there are all kinds of challenges that require new conceptual resources and that can make it productive to integrate concepts from, for example, academic biology and academic ecology into their conceptual apparatus. So the alternative should not be like a pure conservatism that kind of never wants to change any concepts within like local communities. But rather, what we argue for is that what needs to happen is kind of a negotiation between different knowledge systems and different conceptual resources that bring together the conceptual resources of, for example, ecology as we know it as an academic discipline, and the local conceptual resources of the communities. And this is what Jair has been doing in in the local school, right? By, for example, coming up with new teaching materials. So he's been drawing a comic book that introduces concepts from ecology to the students through the comic, but it also introduces traditional concepts by showing how these concepts can be used to address, for example, local pests. So that's a very practical example of how to negotiate and bring different types of concepts together in a local community context. So what are like the wider philosophical lessons of a case like this? Well, one thing that I want to point out is that what this example shows is that conceptual variation is very closely entangled with the local practices and the local livelihoods of communities, right? So if the community, for example, uses the concept of an insect differently than academic scientists and has a different extension for it, it often reflects that for the local practices, it makes much more sense to draw the boundaries of the concepts in different ways than scientists do, who are primarily interested in phylogenetic relations, right? And that immediately leads to the next lesson, namely that for conceptual engineering in local context, we need to engage with the local practices and the local livelihoods of those people, right? So it's not just that we can, as philosophers, say, oh, that's an interesting result, that concepts vary according to the interests and the practices of communities. But those are very straightforward issues that affect the livelihoods of those farmers, right? Like what type of farming practices they use, what kind of conceptual resources they have to engage with pests. So in that sense, conceptual engineering tasks will have to engage with these types of practices if they want to take those communities seriously, right? And then the last lesson is a bit different that I wanted to still point out, because a lot of the data that I presented now is like very qualitative in character, right? It's based on one person spending a lot of time in that community, spending a lot of time with the farmers, doing interviews, working with a local school, coming up with teaching materials and all of that. And I think that is very important compared to what we usually know from experimental philosophy, which is more quantitatively oriented, which can get you so far in analyzing concepts. But if you actually want to engage in the negotiation of concepts for conceptual engineering tasks, you need something much more fine-grained that is often much deeper based on local understanding of why people use certain concepts in certain ways. And that requires also methodologically branching out towards more qualitative research methods. So, in taking that further, the political aspects of addressing concepts of local communities that are different from the kind of concepts that we may expect as scientists, I think are already there in the second case, but it's maybe still a case that sounds rather familiar because it is about concepts that we are relatively familiar with, right? Concepts of fish, concepts of insects, and so on. The third case that takes us from Latin America to Ghana and the very northern corner at the border with Burkina Faso actually takes that to another level by introducing concepts that are in many ways very, very different from the ones that we're used to as scientists. And so what I'm presenting here is a part of this paper that's forthcoming with the title Reconsideration of African Spirituality in Agricultural Development Projects, Traditional Ecological Knowledge from Dagara, Elders, and Kuro in Ghana. And what we want to do in the paper more broadly is to challenge people who are talking about development, and especially agricultural development, and who are often emphasizing the need to bring in local perspectives and to include local knowledge, to see how that local knowledge is entangled with local worldviews that are often very spiritual and often very different from the worldviews that scientists have. So it's often not enough to say, oh, a local community has a lot of knowledge and they're very sustainable in how they do agriculture without destroying the environment, if you don't understand how that knowledge is embedded in a worldview that's often quite different. Now, I'm not going to present all of that. I'm just going to focus on one case that most directly connects to questions of conceptual engineering. So this is a story that has been collected by Baron and Daniel from the CCOT Center, who have been doing ethnographic work in these communities. I've been talking with elders in the community. And so this story that one of the elders has been telling is about different types of seeds. And so the community there distinguishes between two concepts of seeds. Seeds that are for Bondiri and seeds that are for Bondi Fogli. And this division of two different types of seeds, or two concepts for seeds, is very much embedded in the local cosmology and the local way how the community relates to its ancestors. Because the first type of seed is the seeds that are used by the ancestors. Right? So there are seeds that are, for example, including yam or certain millet or certain beans that have been used for generations. The second type of seed are seeds that are more recently introduced and that are largely used as cash crops, like rice or maize or sweet potato. And so the conceptual distinction between two different kinds of seeds is very much embedded in this way how the community thinks about ancestors. For example, you can only use the first type of seeds in rituals, because the latter type of seeds would not be recognized by the ancestors, right? So for example, if someone dies and has to be buried, you have to present seeds, but you can only present the first type of seed because the second type of seed would not be recognized by the ancestors. So there's a conceptual distinction that's very different from the way how an agricultural scientist would think about seeds, right? And it is something still that would be that is very much entangled with the way how the community practices agriculture and the way how the community is able to live sustainably. So one of the benefits, for example, of having that distinction is to ensure that local traditional seeds and the biodiversity that comes with it remains preserved, because you can't bury anyone without presenting those old type of seeds, right? Another benefit that would come from it, for example, is to ensure food security in the community. So if you only focus on cash crops like corn or sweet potato or rice, if you have a bad harvest, you have nothing to eat, right? If you have to also grow the first type of crops, right, because you need to maintain those seeds, you always have something to eat in the community, even if the cash crops have a bad harvest. So in a way, those distinctions are related to the spiritual worldview of the community, but they're also very much related to the way how the community organizes its way of living. And so we have conceptual distinctions that do not map at all on the way how scientists will distinguish between different types of seeds. Again, me trying to kind of take some of the wider lessons from this into a philosophical domain. So one part I think that we need to take seriously is, if we want to do conceptual engineering from a global level, is that concepts that we can't just engage with the concepts that we already know, right? I mean, of course, we can say, oh, so what's their concept of insects or their concept of fish, or we can ask about like how people use the concept of knowledge or whatever. But in a way, that's like our conceptual priorities that we're taking into different contexts, right? And often the concepts that matter for local communities may not have any equivalent in the language that we speak, right? So if you want to take those conceptual perspectives seriously, we also have to think about novel concepts and how they matter for those communities, right? And the other lesson is that local concepts and the way how the boundaries are drawn are often very much entangled with local worldviews and ways of life that make it quite difficult to interpret for scientists. In the last case, that was already kind of obvious, but it only related to agricultural practices that I think are relatively easy to understand still for scientists, of saying, oh, okay, so if you do that type of agriculture, maybe you want to draw the boundaries around the concept of insect differently. In this case, the conceptual distinction between different types of seeds very much reflects the local worldview and how that community relates to its ancestors. That's radically different from that of a scientist who would go there. Great. So the last case that I wanted to present takes some of these lessons into a more global domain. So right now, basically everything that I've been talking about are kind of micro studies of specific communities, right? And so as a philosopher, you may think, well, but how do we scale that up towards like the broad concepts that philosophers typically discuss, right? Typically, philosophers don't discuss the concept of one specific community, but they try to discuss like the most general concepts, right? Like, for example, all the conceptual engineering debates about gender and race in the social domain. Now, the last concept that I want to discuss is the concept of development, which I think is a concept that is just as important and powerful as the concept of gender or race in the social domain, but that, to my knowledge, no one has ever engaged with explicitly as an issue of conceptual engineering, right? So in terms of the history, development, in the sense that I'm talking about it as international development, is a relatively recent concept. It's basically a concept that grew out of the post-war and then the Cold War era. And often the way how these conceptual genealogies of development are framed is that it starts with the inaugural address of Harry Truman in 1949, where he claimed that, and that's a quote that you have at the bottom left here, that we must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and the growth of underdeveloped areas. We should make available to peace-loving people the benefits of our store of technical knowledge in order to help them to realize their aspirations for a better life. So in that sense, development, the way it was introduced and the way it kind of became powerful as a tool of global policy was framed as something very positive that would be basically North America and Europe sharing their knowledge, their scientific and their technological knowledge with the underdeveloped world. Now, the way how a lot of the development debates have been going in the global south is that often the notion of development is heavily criticized or rejected. So here's a quote of one of the most influential post-development scholars from Mexico, commenting on Truman's address by saying, on that day, 2 billion people became underdeveloped. From that time on, they ceased being what they were in all their diversity and were transformed into an inverted mirror of another reality, a mirror that belittles them and sends them to the end of the queue, a mirror that defines their identity. So the critique here of Esteve and other people is that the way how development was actually framed was that everyone who was not living a modern Western lifestyle was all of a sudden being put into the box of being underdeveloped, right? and needing the kind of knowledge from the global north in order to become more like them. And that has led to a lot of critical discourses on how to think about change in the development context. I'm noticing that I'm kind of running short of time, so I'm not going to talk about that in all detail. But so one way of reacting to this critique is to reject the notion of development, which has been the post-development school that has been quite popular in Latin America. For example, Arturo Escobar, who's like a Colombian post-development scholar. One thing that I learned from one of our students, Ifa, who's been looking at the notion of development in Ghana, is how different types of development negotiations are happening there. So it's not just either sticking with the old paternalistic idea of developing the underdeveloped world or rejecting the notion of development entirely, but there have been also attempts to reinterpret the concept of development. For example, it's become quite popular in the development industry to talk about inclusive development, right? So development that's not just about modernizing the rest of the world and making them more Western, but rather creating change that actually responds to the interests and the concerns of local communities. Another way of reframing development is to think of it as endogenous development, which is in a way more radical than inclusive development. It's not just scientists including the perspectives of local communities, but rather trying to put development in the hands of local communities, of them defining what development should be. Now the labels that I've given them, to some of them will probably sound familiar, of like eliminativism or amelioration, because that's actually a quite similar structure as in conceptual engineering debates about issues like race and gender that you may know from Sally Haslinger and others, right? So often it starts with kind of the critique of an established concept. In the case of top-down development, the kind of paternalistic character of it. In the case of gender and race, often the kind of underlying essentialism there. And then the question what to do with that concept after the critique, right? One option is to kind of just eliminate it, which has been proposed by the post-development school in development studies. In the case of race, many of you will be familiar with that a lot of philosophers think we should just get rid of the concept of race because it's just too misleading. And then other people who are trying to reinterpret those concepts through conceptual re-engineering, right? Like thinking of race, for example, as a social constructivist ways as something that reflects social positioning, or cultural constructivism of thinking of race as cultural groups, right? Or thinking of gender in terms of identity and so on. So re-engineering projects that would keep concepts like gender and race, while reinterpreting them beyond the kind of essentialist notion that's often attached to them. The same is happening in the development context, where some people want to get rid of the concept, others are trying to come up with different ways of reinterpreting that concept in ways that would mitigate some of the politically problematic implications, while still insisting that we need the concept in one way or another. Great. So I think to kind of wrap this up, I'm going to move away now from the 4 case studies that I presented, and I'm going to try to draw some more general and hopefully also controversial conclusions and recommendations about the state and future of conceptual engineering. So on the one hand, I think there's kind of like a positive lesson from what I've said. I think the tools of conceptual analysis and conceptual engineering, as they've been developed by philosophers, right, can make valuable contributions to understanding global conceptual negotiations. So as you've seen in my presentation, for example, I've reinterpreted the controversy around the concept development in terms of like the structure that we're already familiar with as conceptual engineers from the gender and race debates, right? Or some of the stuff that we've been doing has been kind of looking quite similar to what experimental philosophers have been doing. At the same time, and that's kind of the negative part, I would say that the current state of the field of conceptual engineering and conceptual analysis is far from being adequately engaged with these types of issues, right? And by doing so, it tends to reproduce epistemic and conceptual injustices of focusing mostly on the concepts that matter for people who are in the position to become academic philosophers, and mostly reflecting the kind of concerns that are relevant in the global north, while not really engaging with the type of concerns that the rest of the world would have regarding these types of concepts. And so in that sense, the maybe controversial part, one way of framing that would be, of course, to say, well, conceptual engineering needs to be decolonized, right? And so I know the decolonizing term can be kind of scary for people who work in the field, and then someone comes along and tells them, well, your field needs to be decolonized. But I do think that there are ways of making sense of that, in the sense that as philosophers who are engaging with questions of conceptual engineering from the perspective of the global north, we need to become more reflexive about what concepts we're discussing, and with what types of epistemic and social concerns we're doing that. And so to wrap things up, I'm just going to give 4 positive recommendations of what decolonizing conceptual engineering may mean. And I'm just going to read them. So the first one would be that we need to take debunking projects global. Many concepts have hidden politics that we philosophers ignore due to the social composition of academic philosophy. So I think that's been clear in many of the case studies that I've been discussing. So, for example, the way how development has been introduced as something neutral or obviously positive, right? While then actually often creating environmental harm, social harm for communities in the global south. And so there's a hidden politics to the way how development is negotiated that's often not so obvious for philosophers. And so I think that's very much in line with what I think Haslinger has originally called debunking projects, right? And applied to gender and race, concepts that we kind of take as obvious and neutral. And then we show how they often have like actually underlying political issues that need to be uncovered. And that can even happen in the case of concepts that seem very innocent, right? Like the concept of an insect, right? So the question of like for example, how the boundaries of animals or plants are being negotiated is not something that is so straightforward as you may think if you don't look at it through the biological concepts of other people than academic biologists. Recommendation 2. The scope of conceptual engineering discourses needs critical evaluation. Not only politics of concepts, but many concepts remain hidden because of who they do or do not affect, right? So it's not just that we may have already been discussing the concept of species or biological taxonomies without recognizing that there's a politics attached to it. But it's also a question, what concepts do we actually discuss in conceptual engineering seminars or volumes or whatever, and what concepts do we not discuss, right? And so I think the case of development is very straightforward here because it's such a powerful concept. It's a concept that has shaped like so much of global policy from like the United Nations, Sustainable Development Goals, the way the IMF works, the way how NGOs work, the way how the major donors work, from like the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation to like small NGOs working in local context, the way how national economic policies are structured, right? The way how we think or do not think about the concept of development has like literally affected the lives of billions of people since the second half of the 20th century. And it is nothing that we're discussing as philosophers, as conceptual engineering, because it's not really our lives that have been straightforwardly affected through that, right? It's mostly the people who are not part of like philosophical seminars, right? Who've been affected by the conceptual politics of that. So we do have to think about like what concepts do we discuss and what concepts do we not discuss and why not, right? Third recommendation, conceptual engineering needs to talk with rather than merely about the global south. In this sense, conceptual engineering needs to be empirical and transdisciplinary. So one of the things that often go wrong when whether it's philosophers or scientists are engaging with global south context is, of course, that they think they already have all the relevant knowledge. But in the end, it turns out that a lot of their recommendations are actually counterproductive because they're misleading people and the kind of social policies that actually end up facilitating more harmful policies. And so in order to address that, I do think that philosophers do need to get out of the armchair here, and they need to actually engage in detail with the kind of local context that they want to come up, where they want to formulate conceptual engineering recommendations. Now, that's the reason why I kind of moved away from just doing philosophy and doing something that's much more empirical now. I don't think that's necessarily the case for every philosopher, that you kind of have to start doing philosophical field work. I think a lot of this can also happen by engaging with empirical literature. But there is certainly the sense in which it needs to be much more empirically engaged. And then the last recommendation is a more methodological one on disappear now, on how to do that empirical engagement. So empirically engaged philosophy needs to transform from experimental into mixed methods philosophy. Qualitative methods are indispensable when negotiating concepts in the light of local livelihoods and practices. So I think in each of the four cases that I presented to you, a lot of the insights for conceptual engineering come out of like careful ethnographic work of people actually spending a lot of time with the communities, trying to understand the nuances of the concepts and why the concepts matter for certain practices, right? And so I don't want to say that there's anything wrong with experimental philosophy or quantitative methods. As you can see from the first case that I presented, we're actually also working with quantitative methods, and that can get you quite far, but it can only get you so far, right? And so I think there's this tendency for analytic philosophers to kind of look too much towards the cognitive sciences and towards the quantitative methods that they employ, and too little to anthropology and like more ethnographic work. And I think if we want to step from conceptual analysis to conceptual engineering by actually trying to figure out which concepts work for people, we need to also employ more qualitative methods and integrate them with the way how experimental philosophy usually operates. Okay. That's it for now.